Let us, without further ado, speak to Helen Dale, writer, lawyer, political commentator, a woman of many parts. Helen, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, Mike. How are you?
I'm all right. I'm very pleased to say that I can announce without fear or favour that the climate crisis has now been averted. We have brought people from around the world to sit around a table, have several dinners together and make several speeches, and apparently it's all sorted now.
Oh, and we've also, the great British public, have managed to teach Wolf Blitzer that Edinburgh and Glasgow are not exactly the same city.
Yes, tremendous work that was from CNN, wasn't it? Absolutely tremendous.
I just saw people, some of the comments I saw were just, oh, doesn't Glasgow Castle look lovely this time of year?
I know. It was the way as well
Glasgow
that they
would like a word.
Yeah, the way that they'd set up the shot so that they had the castle in the background as if
it's
they
overlooking
didn't
the
know.
grass market.
Yeah, I mean,
overlooking
incredible.
the grass market, literally opposite the house where I used to live. No,
Right.
I didn't live in the castle. I lived in one of the little tenements on the street.
Yes. I mean, it's a bit like going to New York to cover the presidential inauguration ceremony, isn't it?
Mm. Yes, we all know Glasgow is prettier and has got a nice castle, but
yes, quite exactly.
But
I mean, it was a very odd collection of. I mean, the fact that it's still going on kind of makes me feel even more strangely about this whole COP26 business. But it was a very odd gathering altogether. There was a picture that was put out by one of the Sky reporters yesterday, where there was literally nobody in the auditorium. You know, I think Rishi Sunak was speaking, but there was no one there. As if, you know, nobody was interested in listening, even though they were delegates to the thing. And when Boris, it's just mad.
It was just bonkers.
Yeah.
And well, you've got this thing where it was given wall-to-wall coverage and the media decided it was hugely important. And to be fair, it had the sort of characteristics that you associated. This is going to date me and probably date you as well, that I certainly associated with arms limitation talks from the 80s. And I was very much put in mind of things like the SALT talks. Now, I'm going to have to say the SALT talks in the 80s. SALT stood for Strategic Arms Limitation Talks.
Yes.
And my enduring memory of those, and I don't know what yours were, you would have been covering many of them, I suspect, at the time as a young journalist. My overwhelming memory was, here are two countries that have thousands of nuclear warheads each, deciding to have 5 less.
Right. And it was really just a sort of a talking shop, wasn't it?
Just a talking shop.
Yes.
And it was ridiculous. And people seem to have forgotten that understanding that we did develop in the 80s and the 70s with the Cold War and the fallout after the Cuban Missile Crisis, that all these international talking shops and talking fests that they do mean nothing.
No. But that's the
and
point.
We used to have the cynicism to understand that. We've lost that ability to say, no, this is just an opportunity for politicians to backscratch each other.
I mean, also I'm slightly disturbed by the media's reaction to it all, because I've heard, you know, reporter after reporter after journalist after journalist after presenter all talking about the climate as if there is all this certainty about the temperature and about how, well, of course, you know, they might not be able to agree on making it stop rising above 1.5%. They might have to move slightly to 2%. You know, the Chinese might have an input into that, as if it's all absolutely definitely happening, which we know that it isn't.
There was a very good piece by a climate scientist I saw, or quoting it by a journalist quoting extensively climate scientists, and I think the IPCC reports as well, saying that the catastrophizing figures that are being used, particularly to scare children, are just nonsense.
Yeah. Well, the IPCC, I was going to say, Helen, the IPCC hasn't got one prediction right in its history. It's kind of the Neil Ferguson of the United Nations.
This is the broader problem, which we've discussed previously on the Independent Republic, of trying to forecast the future in complex systems. So in that case, the IPCC is struggling with the same problems that the Bank of England struggled with Brexit, and the same problems that the various epidemiologists have struggled with when it comes to COVID. It's very important in this context to separate good science, which is what your vaccine developments at Oxford and your virologists succeeded in doing, and a lot of very bad science. And the problem we've got with this whole follow the science thing is there is no such animal as the science. No. That's not how it works. It's a method. And so you've got that issue. And then you've got the problem with good science being contaminated by association with bad science. And I'm afraid dodgy forecasts are a classic example of that. People get sick of it. It becomes like astrology.
And also, well, you're exactly right. I mean, it's a great way to describe it, because it's nothing more than that, really. There really is no reason to believe any model other than a model which is entirely based on what has so far happened, right? Because most of these models are based on what might happen, what could happen, what will happen if something becomes the case, rather than what is actually happening now.
Well, they do try. The IPCC does try to do a form of backcasting based on what we already know. But the thing is, traditionally, there are ways around this, Bayesian statistical methods and so on and so forth. But in a very traditional and basic sense, backcasting doesn't work. And it's for the same reason, forecasting the future in a complex system. I mean, I remember when that sort of maths, because back in the day, for my sins, I used to be a corporate solicitor. And I always remembered people, you used to file these claims, and they were always from people who were a bit strange, like the kind of person who tried to guarantee you a 10% return a year on if you invested in this scheme. And that was basically a big red flag for Ponzi scheme. People who tried to say that they could pick stock movements, forecast the stock market, basically. And always, if you were a corporate lawyer or working in corporate finance or banking, those were the kind of emails or correspondence that you put in the same drawer if you were a gentleman, with all of those items of correspondence that tried to tell you that you could enlarge certain parts of your anatomy without surgery. It was just nonsense. Right. And we all knew it was nonsense, and a little bit more honesty in this area is necessary. And to their credit, some of the more thoughtful climate scientists are saying this. Stop trying to scare kids. Stop using the most extreme range of the IPCC's reports that even they don't like. And stop making this like a giant international jamboree, because the world's opinion of those things haven't changed since the SALT talks. You might think they're hugely important and insignificant, think that the global rules-based order is a marvelous thing, but you haven't brought the public with you. It's one of those things like Brexit. If you haven't brought the public with you, Remain wanting their second referendum, failed to bring the public with them, and they contributed in no small part to that 2019 landslide election result.
Well, of course. And also, as we've been saying all week, the inability of this government to stop water companies from pumping sewage into the sea, basically because the system of trying to stop them doesn't work, because it's better for the companies to pay the fine than it is to actually upgrade their administrative works and to upgrade their equipment and all of the rest of it, and their sort of foundations. So the pollution goes on. So the idea that they're going to make laws or make rules or introduce
for the whole planet,
for the entire planet, is a complete and utter nonsense, isn't it?
It's a furphy. That's an Australian expression which I think we should introduce to the UK.
Okay.
A furphy. And
is that like a fugazi?
I'm not sure. It was coined by an Australian writer, and it's basically the country labourers version. These were the stockmen who worked in the countryside, standing around a well, talking to each other, telling yarns. And the yarns would get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the fish that had been captured would get longer and longer and wider and wider. And that was the Aussie version of the modern water cooler chat. And they were called furfies. And so, you're telling furfies, are you? Lots of furfies.
Yes.
Funny stories that aren't true.
Yes.
Maybe entertaining, but they're not true.
No. Well, that is what the entire climate sort of industry is based on, isn't it? Because you've got all these people catastrophizing everything, talking about how the earth is doomed. Boris Johnson talking about us being strapped to a doomsday machine. People saying that we've only got, 24 hours to save the earth, like Flash Gordon says in the movie. We've had all this with the NHS. We've had it all with COVID. Now we're getting it with climate. It's almost as though they're using the same model to brainwash everybody into believing what they're saying.
I'm not sure, and I'm not sure if the brainwashing is work. I mean, I take Laura Dodsworth's point that running a scare campaign did seem to work during COVID, but there is very substantial empirical evidence to show that people become more authoritarian in response to pathogens. Yeah. And I mean, that evidence is hundreds of years old. So we've known about this for a while. But the other one is wars. Wars and pathogens makes people more, they like the smack of firm government and become more insular and inward looking. But that's not necessarily true in other areas. And if people don't get a sense that there is any actual real threat, or alternatively, it's going to hit them in the hip pocket. That's the other thing. I mean, there's been quite a lot of research to show that people are concerned about the climate and are concerned about conservation, but they're very, very reluctant to pay anything in terms of mitigation. And that doesn't just apply to climate change. There's a lot of difficulty in parts of the United States and in Australia, just training people to do normal environmental mitigation, like low temperature burns in forested areas or otherwise, because if you let the leaf litter build up and build up and build up over decades, that's how you have the really catastrophic burns that kill the trees and also destroy livestock and kill people in Australia and California because of the eucalypts in both places. So it can be very, very difficult to get people to take something seriously when there's no obvious visible threat to them, and they feel like they're being constantly sold panic. And after a while, you keep pressing the panic button and it becomes like the definition of insanity. You do it over and over again.
This is where we've reached. I think this is the point we've reached, certainly in a lot of parts of this country now, where people are sort of suffering from COVID fatigue. You know, all these people that keep talking about, well, it would be a good idea really to reintroduce masks, not least because it would keep people on their guard, because at the moment it seems as though people have decided that it's all over and they're not wearing masks anymore. Well, guess what? That's because people do believe that, because they've been told a lot of rubbish for such a long time about how much more terrible it's going to get, and they're not buying it anymore.
It does appear that populations have their tipping point. For example, Victoria in Australia, longest lockdown in the world in Melbourne, the capital city, as I think most people know, and also a very different experience from the rest of Australia, which had very short lockdowns or none at all. Victoria had this shocking authoritarian approach to it. The government's rapidly coming out of lockdown now, and the rationale, as I understand it from people in the Canberra Press Gallery and people covering Australian politics, is in many respects simply because they did private polling and people have run out of patience.
Yes.
They found they found the tipping point. They don't really know whether it was the rubber bullets out in front of the Shrine of Remembrance with the CFMEU. They don't really know those. They can't pin it to one particular thing, but they have got enough data, and Australians are very good at this, data collection in politics, to go, no, the Victorian public's run out of patience. We need to stop now, otherwise no mitigation efforts, even if they were needed, if they became necessary, will be taken seriously by the people. They've just sort of snapped.
No, I think that's absolutely right. Let's talk about something you're also quite familiar with, and that is, of course, the situation at the University of Sussex, where a relatively well-regarded lecturer and student of philosophy, I suppose you might describe her as, or a partaker in many great discussions about a great many things, has had to resign, not least because it turns out today an awful lot of her fellow professors were actually ganging up on her, all because she had a view on the trans debate.
The situation with Kathleen Stock is really quite alarming. And the thing that makes it alarming, and I do, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with her particular take on
that's
this
not
issue,
the issue, is it? Really?
That's irrelevant.
It should be irrelevant.
Get someone like Belinda in, like you're planning to do on the Independent Republic, to talk about the actual substantive issue and how silly it can be. I'm just going to focus on the free speech aspect, because Kathleen Stock, it's the trans issue with her. But with Neil Tin up in Edinburgh, it was to do with the way he taught his anthropology course. It was nothing to do with the trans issue, and I don't even know, I mean, I know him slightly, but I don't know what his views are on this. With Nigel Biggar at the University of Oxford, it was the way he taught his, he's a specialist in the history of colonisation and the British Empire, and it was the way, it was arguments that he made in an academic paper, and he got this as well. With John Finnis, it was the way he approached natural law and human rights, that kind of thing. And you had people, I remember with Finnis, because he was one of my tutors at Oxford, people dogpiling John Finnis and saying, you have to, and I just remember looking at them and thinking, do you not understand that if you take John Finnis's arguments out from underneath international law and human rights, you have nothing, because those two legal traditions emerge out of Christianity, and specifically Catholic Christianity. And Finnis basically updates St. Thomas Aquinas from the Middle Ages to make them usable for modern people. But because they come out of a Catholic tradition, they say rude things about homosexuals and women. You expect this. But That's because of the tradition they come from. That doesn't mean that the actual underlying legal arguments are nonsense. So this is right across the universities. People who step out of line in one way or another. And I mean, and obviously the Kathleen Stock thing is egregious. She was being burnt in effigy. They were setting off flares. We know
Well,
they're
she was
dangerous.
genuinely in fear of her life, wasn't she?
Oh, she was. Yeah, there's this tunnel. I've seen photographs of it now, and this has always been a bad way. I mean, notoriously on council estates around Oxford, there were a couple that you couldn't actually get out of the estate unless you went through one of those horrible tunnels. They're never safe. But it appears the way the campus is set up that everybody, students and teachers, are being funneled through this underground tunnel that's really quite dangerous. And it was carpeted with posters, nasty posters about Kathleen Stock. And she had to walk through it. And then the nasty little blighters were at the other end of it, setting off flares.
Yeah, unbelievable.
I mean, what
and I mean, I was talking about this on Plank of the Week because we put the University of Sussex in for Plank of the Week. But I mean, not only did the university not really do enough to protect her, but it seems as though her fellow academics were actively seeking her dismissal.
It seems, yes, it's become, I mean, without straying into an area where we're going to finish up libeling anyone, because I strongly suspect litigation will come from this. There will be litigation. It's just got nasty employment tribunal written all over it.
Yeah, because the problem presumably for her is that she's going to find it very difficult to get any kind of employment in any university in this country now.
Because they're all so timid, and that's why it's actually worth watching her interview. You get visual with Unheard, but also to listen to the BBC Woman's Hour one. I made a point of doing both yesterday, and just the extent to which various scholars, people who absolutely should know better, are just, not only with her, but with a large number of other academics with different views, deliberately working. The Australian expression is white-anting, which are termites that eat the timber frame of your house, going behind the backs of these various scholars, weakening their position in such a way that it makes it much, much easier for them to be dismissed. It's the most appalling behaviour. I mean, like, the thing that comes to me is Mean Girls, what the Americans call middle school.
Yeah.
You know, and it also seems to have, it's got this persecutory religious quality that people in a comedic sense associate with, Life of Brian, or Nobody Expects the Inquisition out of Monty Python. It's got this inquisitorial religious aspect to it, where if you criticize the standard woke view, you're a type of heretic. And I watched the Unheard one, and then that's why I put that tweet out, that wokery is what you get when you feed theology after midnight.
It's a good point, because it is a religion, isn't it? I mean,
it's like a religion.
I'm sort of constantly batting away these mad lefties who come on to my Twitter feed every single week at various different times. They all seem to come at the same time at one point, and then they disappear for a few days. So it does strike me that it's a bit of a coincidence. But, they just don't understand ordinary people. They don't understand the way that actual people live. I mean, I had a call from a woman yesterday, Patricia, I think, in Littlehampton, who said, look, we're an elderly couple, both 70, love talk radio, listen to it all the time, every day. We've retired, we have reasonable pensions, but, we have to get a new car. We've got £6,000 to buy a second-hand car. That's all we've got. We can't spend any more than that. We can't go green. We can't buy a heat pump. We haven't got the money. We do what we can. We recycle where we can. But, that's the reality of most people's lives. It's not, like the sort of, the millionaires from Chiswick and Putney who can spend as much money as you like on a car, who can go glamping in Cornwall and spend £20,000 in St Ives instead of having to pop off to the Maldives, But these are not ordinary people with ordinary lives. They don't understand ordinary people.
It does seem that there's a widespread issue with people who are quite wealthy not understanding the lives of people who don't have money.
Right.
And you see this, and when I say don't have money, I don't mean people who are on their uppers and in desperate poverty.
No, people who work for a living, but who just are...
people who work for a living. They're just about managing, I suppose, is the old expression for them. There's an extraordinary lack of awareness from people who, I have to say, come largely from my social background, so it's very embarrassing. And this was notable through the coronavirus pandemic, when you had people piling into Londoners who lived in tiny flats because the only way they could get out was to go to the park because they don't have gardens,
Right.
posh people have gardens, poorer people don't. And this has been a persistent issue with large numbers of our betters basically simply not grasping what forms the substantive content of a household budget. And the thing is, if you don't know, and I didn't know, because I have a relatively easy life and I have to admit that, I went and found research about, how much, for example, accommodation costs, whether it's a mortgage or rent that you're paying, how much your groceries costs, how much motor vehicles, or if you're in London and you use tube all the time, how much these things cost. And just once you add them all up, people are left with tuppence halfpenny.
But this is, again,
my dad used to say, without a penny to bless themselves.
It's the problem we have with this government as well. We've got to leave it there, though, Helen, because we're running out of time. Thank you very much indeed. Helen Dale talking there about the kind of, it's almost like